I was not a man who believed in justice. That is a strange confession from someone who spent 30 years administering it, who sat on the bench of quarter sessions, who reviewed his tenants' disputes with the same cold attention he gave military dispatches, who once turned a magistrate out of his position for taking a shilling from the wrong hand. I believed in order. I believed in the law. I believed in the clear lines that held the world together and kept men like me from the same ruin that had swallowed lesser families before us. But justice, the kind that tends to the overlooked, that sees through arrangement and circumstance to the person underneath, that was not something I had ever troubled myself about. Until the morning Aloan Vane arrived at Wynthorpe Hall in a hired trap with one trunk, and her father's sins trailing behind her like smoke. I did not go to meet her. I want to say that clearly before I speak well of myself again, because I will not earn the right to speak well of myself if I begin by erasing what I was. I stood at the library window with a document in my hand, the settlement agreement my solicitor Hartwell had drawn up on behalf of the Vane estate, and I watched the trap come up the lane through a skim of February frost, and I did not move. I had not asked for this arrangement. My brother Crispin had negotiated it as a favor to a neighbor, an act of what he called compassion, but which I recognized as the sort of meddling that made him feel useful without requiring him to put his own name on anything. Our family held the Vane mortgages. The father, Thomas Vane, had made a ruin of everything left to him by his wife's family, and when the last creditor called the final note, there was nothing left to pay it with except the elder daughter. Aloan, 24, unmarried, deemed plain enough by Wynthorpe society to be of no interest to anyone better positioned than a ruined man's creditor. That was the logic of the thing. The debt settled, in the manner such debts have always been settled, with a woman who had not been consulted. I read the document 3 times that morning, and the 4th time I looked up and saw the trap in the lane, I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was a cold and particular fury. Not at Aloan Vane, whom I had never met, but at the clean, legal, entirely respectable set of circumstances that had produced her arrival at my door, as though she were a shipment of timber or a parcel of indifferent acreage. I did not go down to meet her. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alderley, showed her in. I gave them an hour on the premise of estate business, and then I walked into the east drawing-room where she had been deposited with tea and the distant sound of the house going about itself. She was standing at the window. I had expected a great many things from the daughter of Thomas Vane, a man I had never respected, and whose financial catastrophe I had watched with the weary recognition of a gamekeeper who has seen a particular predator's trail before. I had expected some combination of fear, prettiness as a compensating strategy, or the particular kind of defeat that makes a person seem to have already left the room before you have finished speaking to them. I had, if I am being entirely honest, expected very little. The settlement document had used the word agreeable, a word that in the language of such arrangements means precisely nothing. What I found was a young woman of middling height, brown-haired, with her hair done up in the plainest style imaginable, wearing a wool traveling dress that had been mended at the left cuff with thread of almost but not quite the right color. She was looking out at the frost on the grounds. She did not turn when I entered. And when she did turn, perhaps 5 seconds later, after she had finished whatever thought she was completing in her own good time, her eyes were the clearest and most unremarkable gray I had ever seen, and her expression was composed in the way that a very particular kind of person is composed. Not because they are not afraid, but because they have decided that composure is the only thing that belongs entirely to them, and so they will not surrender it. She curtsied. She said, "Your Grace." I said, "Miss Vane." And then we stood in the drawing-room of Wynthorpe Hall and regarded each other, and I thought, whoever managed this arrangement has managed it without any notion of what they have done to either party, and I am not certain which of us I feel sorrier for. Though looking at her, I suspected she would not welcome pity from a stranger, so I kept the thought to myself. "You have been shown your rooms," I said. "I have." A pause. "They are very fine rooms, Your Grace." "They are the guest rooms," I said, "as that is what you are." I said it without thinking, as a clarification, but I heard it in the air between us after I had spoken, and it landed differently than I had intended, not as courtesy, as a line drawn. She held my eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I imagine so." I dismissed myself on the grounds of estate business, and I went back to the library, and I stood at the window again after she had gone, and I was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, not entirely certain what to do next. That was how it began. There are things I should explain about Wynthorpe Hall before I explain about Alo in Vain, because the house had become, by that winter, the sort of place that tells you a great deal about a man without a word being said. My father had built the east wing in the warm part of his life, when he believed in large tables and loud fires and the particular kind of optimism that fills a room with people. He had died early, too early, my mother always said, meaning before I could absorb enough of his warmth to insulate against what the world would ask of me. I had been 19 when he died. I had been 23 when I married. I had been 27 when she left. I do not speak of my wife often, and I will not dwell on her here because this is not a story about her, and I have spent enough of my interior life on that particular subject to last me through whatever years remain. What I will say is that by the time Alo in Vain arrived at my door, the east wing had been closed for 6 years. The large dining table was set for one, and I had come to think of the quiet of Wynthorpe Hall not as emptiness, but as the only honest condition left to me. I had learned very thoroughly not to want things. It is a useful lesson. It is also, as I came to understand, a lesson that makes a man into a kind of well-maintained ruin, presentable from the outside, no roof to speak of. My household at that time consisted of Mrs. Alderley, who had been at Wynthorpe Hall since before I was born, and who regarded me with the particular patience of a woman who has watched a family go through difficult passages before and expects this one to resolve itself in the fullness of time. Hartwell, my solicitor, who came from York on the first Monday of each month. My steward Gibbs, who was devoted and competent, and had the good sense to offer me information rather than opinions. A cook whose name was Mrs. Pendle, 3 kitchen maids, a stable staff I will not enumerate, and my valet Prescott, who is the person who told me in later years that he had known from the second morning that it would end as it did. Prescott has an irritating gift for retrospective wisdom that I have never entirely succeeded in discouraging. Eloin, in those first weeks, made herself as small as a person of her nature can make themselves, which is to say, not very small at all, but with the genuine effort of someone who is trying. She took her meals in her rooms when I had guests, which was rarely, and she did not appear in the principal rooms of the house during the working hours of the day, which was either her own choice or someone's instruction, and I found I did not particularly want to know which, because knowing would have required me to issue a counter-instruction, and I had not yet worked out what that would be. She asked Mrs. Alderley what she was permitted to help with, a question that alarmed Mrs. Alderley greatly, as no one had ever asked her such a thing. And when Mrs. Alderley in confusion said she was permitted to help with whatever she liked, Eloin took this to mean the still room, where she spent 2 mornings cataloging and relabeling the entire herbal stock, because it had apparently been in a state of disorder that she found difficult to ignore. Mrs. Alderley had told me about this with the air of a woman who is constructing a position and has not yet decided what that position is. The labels, she told me, were very clear. The alphabetical organization was, she admitted when I pressed her, an improvement. I told her to tell Miss Vane that any reasonable assistance she wished to offer was welcome, and to find suitable tasks if Miss Vane could not find them herself. Mrs. Alderley received this instruction with the expression she reserved for things that were going to require further elaboration in due course, and went away. I saw Eloin 3 times in the first week. Once at dinner, which I had decided she would take with me regardless of guests, because the alternative, feeding her in her rooms like a problem to be kept out of sight, struck me as an indignity I was not willing to inflict, whatever else this situation was. Once in the corridor outside the library where she stopped when she saw me coming and said, "Good morning, Your Grace," and I said, "Good morning," and we passed each other with the precision of 2 people navigating a very narrow bridge. And once, late on Thursday afternoon, when I came through the kitchen garden on my way back from the home farm and found her standing at the gate in the last gray light, her coat not heavy enough for the cold, looking at the frost-stiffened beds with an expression I did not immediately know what to call. She heard my step and turned. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't certain how far my liberty extended." "The grounds are open to you," I said. She nodded. What did it look like in summer? The question surprised me. No one had asked me what Wynthorpe Hall looked like in summer in a very long time. I thought about it, the actual answer, not a polite deflection, and I said, "The kitchen garden was my mother's. She kept it well. The herbs there are the ones she planted, mostly. The rosemary along the south wall." The rosemary in the still room, Eloin said. The plants along the south wall. Yes. They're still living. She said it not as a compliment, but as a simple fact, the way a person reports what they have observed. Under the frost, you can feel the stalks. The wood hasn't gone soft. I looked at her. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the south wall of the kitchen garden with the rosemary dormant against it. I said, "You know plants." "My mother's garden," she said, and then she was quiet in the way people are quiet when they have said a name that costs something. After a moment she added, "Before my father managed to sell it." I had nothing useful to say to that, so I said nothing. We stood for a moment in the cold, and then she wished me good evening and went back in, and I stood at the kitchen garden gate in the last light and thought about the rosemary, and what it meant that it was still living under the frost, and why that should matter to me in the least. It did matter, though I did not know yet why. Dinner, in those first weeks, was conducted with a formality that served us both. There were long stretches of silence that were not precisely uncomfortable, more like the silence of two people who have each decided that unnecessary speech is a courtesy neither of them requires. We spoke of the weather, which in February in the north of England is a legitimate subject requiring genuine attention. We spoke briefly of the estate. She asked questions about the tenancy arrangements with an interest I was not certain was genuine, until the third or fourth time she asked a question precise enough to indicate she had been thinking about the previous answer. We did not speak of her father, or the debt, or the arrangement, or Crispin, or anything that would have required either of us to perform a reaction we had not fully prepared. It was Mrs. Pendle's cooking that first cracked the silence. Mrs. Pendle was not an exceptional cook. She was a reliable cook, a woman who had been producing the same 17 dishes for 12 years with the consistency of someone who considers novelty an affectation. Her mutton pie was reliable. Her roasted vegetables were reliable. Her puddings were reliable. What she produced on the 9th evening of Eloin's residence was a braised beef that she had attempted for the first time, at whose suggestion I was not immediately informed, and which had the distinction of being both overcooked and, through some alchemy of its own, also somehow simultaneously slightly raw in the center. I ate 2 bites and set down my fork. Eloin ate 1 bite and set down hers. We looked at our plates, and then we looked at each other across the dining table, and Eloin said with absolute composure, "The braising liquid was added too late." "Is that what it is?" I said. "The beef is good," she said. "It simply needed more time in the pot and less time in the oven." She picked up her fork and tried another piece, the way a person runs an experiment. She put it down again. "Yes, too late and too high a heat." "Mrs. Pendle has made this before," I said. "I don't believe so," Eloin said. "I think she was attempting something new." "At whose suggestion?" I said. A small silence. "I may have mentioned," she said, "to one of the kitchen maids that a braised beef is a very straightforward dish and extremely good in cold weather." I looked at her. She met my eyes with complete equanimity. "You suggested the dish," I said, "and Mrs. Pendle attempted it, and the result is this." "Yes," she said, "I owe you a better dinner." She looked at her plate again. "I'll speak to Mrs. Pendle about the braising time." "You will speak to Mrs. Pendle," I said, to be certain I had understood. "If you would rather I didn't." "No," I said. "Please do." I picked up my fork again and ate the rest of the dish with the methodical patience of a man who has endured worse things than a slightly confused braised beef, and I found, by the end of it, that I was not entirely displeased with the evening. There was something bracing about a dinner that had gone wrong in an interesting way. There was something more bracing about the person who had caused it, who ate her own plate with the same composure she brought to everything, and offered no further apology, and did not pretend the beef was better than it was. 3 days later, Mrs. Pendle produced a braised beef that was, I discovered with some surprise, the best thing she had ever cooked. I told her so. She told me that Miss Vane had been extremely helpful with the timing. I told her that Miss Vane was to be consulted on any dish she had an opinion about. Mrs. Pendle received this with an expression of pure relief that told me the instruction had, in some form, already been in effect for several days. The dinner arrangements were the occasion of our first real exchange. It was the 8th day after her arrival. I had been in York for 2 of those days on business, and I had returned to find that in my absence, Eloan had somehow reorganized the seating arrangement for my dining room in a way that made the table usable for one person without looking as though it had been set for a ghost of a larger meal. She had moved 2 chairs and added a screen near the north window. The table, which had for 6 years carried the accusatory air of a surface capable of seating 14 and currently required to seat 1, looked not comfortable exactly, but less like an indictment. I asked Mrs. Alderley about it. Mrs. Alderley said, "Miss Vane noticed you rarely used the lower half of the table, Your Grace, and thought the screen might help with the draft." I said nothing. That evening at dinner I said to Eloan, "You rearranged the dining room." She met my eyes. I hoped that was not overstepping. "It was not overstepping," I said. "It was an observation I should have made myself 6 years ago." A small silence. She said, "Was it always so large a table?" "My father was optimistic," I said. I watched something move in her expression, not quite a smile, but the place a smile comes from. She looked down at her soup. "That is a kind way to say it." "It is an accurate way to say it," I said. "He was wrong about most of the things he was optimistic about, but he was not wrong about this house." "No," she agreed, and she looked around the dining room with its October gold wallpaper and its plaster ceiling frieze, and she said, "It is a very good house. You can feel that it was built with intention." "My father designed the east wing himself," I said. "Or rather, he directed the architect so comprehensively that the architect threatened to resign twice, and my father built the window placement exactly as he'd wanted it anyway." She looked at me, and the architect stayed. "He stayed," I said. "He came to every dinner party for the next 10 years. He said my father had the best eye for proportion of any amateur he'd encountered, and that irritated him enormously." Eloan smiled then, a real one, brief and warm, entirely unperformed, and said, "I can see the proportion from where I'm sitting." "You have not seen a fraction of it," I said. "Show me then," she said. She said it without thinking. I could see the moment she heard herself, a faint change in her posture, a small, careful retreat. "I am sorry, I did not mean to presume." "You did not presume," I said. "Come tomorrow morning, I will show you the house." She looked at me with those clear gray eyes, and I could not tell whether she was surprised or had expected this all along. She said, "All right," and she went back to her soup, and I went back to mine, and the dining room with its rearranged chairs and its screen against the draft felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a room someone was actually sitting in. I showed her the house the next morning. I am not a man given to narrating things. I walked her through the rooms, and she asked questions, and I found myself answering them at a length I had not anticipated, because her questions were not the polite, ornamental questions of a person performing curiosity. They were the actual questions of a person who wanted to know. She asked about the plasterwork in the long gallery and was genuinely interested in the answer. She asked about the provenance of the maps in the library. I had a collection of survey maps from 3 generations of the estate, some of them going back to the reign of George II, and she spent 10 minutes looking at the oldest one, tracing the boundary lines with her finger, asking about changes in the field divisions. She noticed that the bookcase in the morning room had been built into an alcove that was clearly older than the rest of the room, and asked why, and the answer required me to explain the history of the room's previous use as a gun room, and then as a study, and then, briefly and unhappily, as a lumber room before my mother had reclaimed it. She asked why the portrait of my great-grandmother had been moved from the principal bedroom to the upper corridor, and when I said my wife had wanted a different painting there, she did not flinch or offer any of the careful, sympathetic sounds that people usually make when my wife is accidentally mentioned. She just said which painting did she choose, and when I told her a Dutch winter scene, very fine, cold, she said, "That makes a certain sense," and moved on. I found I liked that she moved on. We ended in the east wing, which I had not opened in 6 years. I brought the key from my ring and unlocked the door, and we walked through rooms sheeted in Holland covers, the light coming in gray and cold through shuttered windows. Eloan walked ahead of me, not because I gave her leave to, but because she had simply moved forward, and when I came in behind her, she was standing in the center of the largest room, my father's study, the room he had died in, with her hands at her sides, very still. "What will you do with it?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. It was the first honest answer I had given to that question. I had always before said something about winter and refurbishment and future plans. She turned and looked at me. "You miss him?" she said. "Yes." "You don't talk about him?" she said. Not a criticism, an observation. "There are things that diminish when you talk about them," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And things that enlarge when you do." She did not explain what she meant, and I did not ask, because I thought I understood. She put her hand on the Holland cover of the nearest armchair, my father's armchair, as she could not have known, and said, "When was the last time someone used this room?" "The morning he died," I said. She nodded as though I had told her the time. And then she said, "It should be used again," and walked back past me into the corridor. And I stood in my father's study with the gray light coming in and the smell of dust and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that was the smell of a room waiting. And I thought, she is the most direct person I have encountered in 30 years, and I do not know whether to be disturbed or relieved. I realized, obscurely and entirely relieved. Prescott, who has been my valet since I was 25, and who therefore has a great deal more information about me than is entirely comfortable to acknowledge, asked me about a week into Alohan's residence how I was finding the arrangement. I told him the arrangement was acceptable. Prescott said nothing. He was folding a shirt with the attention of a man who is thinking about something else, and I had known him long enough to know that when he was thinking about something else, he would eventually say what it was. "The household seems to find her agreeable," he said eventually. "I have heard," I said. "Mrs. Alderley is planning to ask her about the linen cupboard," he said, "which has not been properly ordered since the previous Mrs. Alderley passed the management to her." "Mrs. Alderley may do as she sees fit," I said. Another silence. Prescott finished the shirt and started on another. "She found the hothouse," he said. "Miss Vane, on Wednesday morning, Mr. Gibbs showed her." "I see." "She asked Mr. Gibbs about the forcing schedule," Prescott said. "Specifically whether the violets would be ready by February. Mr. Gibbs apparently did not know, and she told him they would if the temperature was kept consistent." I was quiet for a moment, and were they? "Yes," said Prescott. He picked up the next shirt. "The second week of February, Mrs. Alderley put them on the sideboard in the morning room." I had seen the violets. I had assumed Mrs. Alderley had ordered them. I had not asked. "She knows plants," I said, as I had said before, to no one in particular. "She does," Prescott agreed, in the tone of a man who is filing this away. There was a conversation, 3 weeks in, that I should recount precisely, because I have turned it over in my memory so many times that I am afraid of wearing it smooth. Hartwell had come from York. He came, as always, on the first Monday, this time with a revised accounting of the Vane estate's remaining obligations and a question about the settlement's terms. He asked the question in my library, with his papers arranged on my desk and his careful solicitor's expression, which was the face of a man delivering news he has already decided to frame as neutrally as possible. The question, stripped of its framing, was this: was I satisfied with the arrangement as executed, or did I wish to revisit the original terms? The original terms. The settlement document had used careful language, as such documents do, but the plain meaning of the terms was that Alohan Vane's presence in my household, and whatever arrangement might develop from it, would constitute the settlement of her father's debt. The remaining obligation, £3,800, which was what was left after the mortgages had been discharged, would be considered cleared at the end of a period of 12 months, provided the arrangement had been conducted in a manner satisfactory to both parties, and provided that within that 12 months a more permanent arrangement had not been made formal. That was the document. I had read it 4 times. I knew every line of it. "Leave it with me," I told Hartwell. "I will review and respond by the end of the week." Left. I sat for a long time at my desk with the document in front of me and the fire behind me and the sound of Wynthorpe Hall going about its February afternoon. And then I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, her footsteps, which I had come to recognize, the particular rhythm of a person who walks at the pace they actually intend to walk, which is slightly faster than most women in my experience walk in a house that is not their own, and I heard them stop at the library door. She knocked. "Come in," I said. She came in with a letter in her hand and an expression I had not seen on her before, not the composed expression, not the careful one, but something underneath those that was, I thought, the face of a person who has been trying to decide something and has decided. She said, "I beg your pardon. I have had a letter from my sister. She asks about my situation here, and I find I am uncertain what to tell her." I looked at her. I looked at the document on my desk. "What does she ask?" I said. "Whether I am well," Aloan said. "Whether I am free to refuse anything I do not wish to accept. Whether—" She stopped. She drew a very even breath. "Whether I had any choice in the matter." The document was face up on my desk. I did not turn it over. "What is your sister's name?" I said. She looked at me. "Marjorie." "Marjorie Vane." "Marjorie Naylor now," Aloan said. "She married a solicitor in Harrogate." A very faint note of something, not bitterness, but its more dignified cousin, when she said it. "She married the month before my father's difficulties became generally known." "She asks whether you had a choice," I said. "Yes." I sat with that for a moment. The fire behind me ticked and settled. Through the library window the grounds were white under a new frost. I said, "What will you tell her?" Aloan Vane looked at me with those clear, composed gray eyes, the eyes that had assessed me from the east drawing-room window on the day she arrived, the eyes that had told me without a word that she had decided composure was the only thing that was entirely hers, and she said, "I should like to be able to tell her the truth, whatever the truth is." I thought about Hartwell's carefully framed question. I thought about the document. I thought about the 12 months and the £3,800 and the phrase, "conducted in a manner satisfactory to both parties." And I thought about what it meant that I had never, in all of this, asked Aloan Vane whether she wished to be here, whether she had been given any opportunity to choose, or whether there was something she wanted that had nothing to do with discharging her father's debt. I said, "The truth is that you were not given a choice." She held my eyes. "The arrangement was made between my brother and your father's solicitor," I said. "I was informed of it after the fact. You were informed of it, I imagine, in much the same way one is informed of a decision already made. That is the truth." "Yes," she said. "That is the truth." "Then you may tell your sister that," I said. "And you may also tell her that nothing in this house has been asked of you that you were unwilling to give." A long silence. She was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read, not suspicion, not relief, but something careful and waiting, as though she had learned to be very precise about what she allowed herself to believe before she was sure of the ground. "Is that also true?" she said. "Yes," I said, "it is." She nodded. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and she left. I sat for a very long time after she had gone with Hartwell's document on the desk in front of me, and I thought about the kitchen garden rosemary, and the screen near the north window, and the still-room labels in her handwriting that Mrs. Alderley had shown me with an air of someone trying not to be impressed. I thought about the east wing and my father's armchair, and the thing she had said, "It should be used again." And I thought about dinner, which had not for years been a meal I found myself anticipating, and how for the past 3 weeks I had found myself at 5 o'clock thinking about what we might talk about. And I picked up Hartwell's document, and I put it in the fire. I did not do it in front of her. I want to be clear about that. It was not a performance. There was no one in the library to see it, and I did not ring for Prescott to witness the moment, and the document burned in the grate while I sat in my chair and watched it, and no one knew. I would need to write to Hartwell to advise him that the settlement arrangement was dissolved, and that the Vane debt was discharged on other grounds, and he would understand what that meant, and he would draft the necessary correspondence, and none of this would have anything to do with Aloan Vane being a debt repaid. She was not a debt repaid. I had known it, I think, from the morning she arrived and stood at the east drawing-room window and took her time turning around, and I had spent 3 weeks refusing to admit what I had known. I did not tell her that night. I am going to be honest about the timeline of my cowardice, because it is relevant, and because a man who has spent 30 years believing in clear lines owes himself, at least, the discipline of accuracy. I did not tell her that night, or the next night, or the night after that. What I did instead was conduct myself with a scrupulousness that I am not entirely proud of in retrospect. I was unfailingly correct. I was available without being familiar. I was kind in every way that did not require me to say the thing that was pressing very insistently against the inside of my chest. What I was, I understand now, was afraid, and the shape of my fear was very specific. I had been married once, to a woman who had been beautiful and correct, and who had smiled at me across a dining room table very like this one for 4 years before she had told me, very clearly and with perfect composure, that she found my company intolerable and my house unbearable, and that she had loved another man for 3 of those 4 years. I do not tell this story because I wish sympathy. I tell it because it explains the condition I was in when Alo and Vane arrived, and the particular nature of the ice that had formed over the things I had decided to stop wanting. I had decided not to want things. I had made that decision with the intention of never revisiting it. And then there was a woman in my kitchen garden in February talking quietly to a rosemary plant, and the decision was proving considerably less durable than I had believed. I opened the east wing instead. That is to say, I had the Holland covers removed, the fires lit, the shutters drawn back, and I told Mrs. Alderley to put fresh flowers in my father's study when the season permitted. It did not permit yet. It was still February, still cold. But there were hothouse violets from the kitchen garden forcing house, so I told her to use those. I showed Alo in the study one morning without explanation. She walked in, and she saw the fires and the uncovered furniture and the hothouse violets on the desk, and she stood very still for a moment. And then she said quietly, "You opened it." "Yes," I said. She looked at the violets, from the forcing house. "Yes. They were ready," she said. "So I was told," I said. She turned and looked at me, and I thought she was going to say something that would require me to respond to it in the careful manner I had been using, but instead she said, "I'm glad," and looked back at the violets, and then at my father's chair by the window and said, "May I sit here sometimes? When the room is empty, if you'd rather I didn't." "Sit there whenever you like," I said. She nodded. She touched the back of the chair with one hand, not sitting, not taking it, just acknowledging it. "Thank you," she said, and she left. I stood in my father's study with the hothouse violets on the desk, and I thought, I have been managing this very carefully, and I am beginning to suspect that careful management is not going to be the thing that resolves it. I rode out most mornings in March. It was my habit, and I had kept to it without variation for many years, which is the kind of detail that tells you a great deal about the shape a life has settled into. The grounds of Wynthorpe Hall are extensive, 400 acres, much of it farmland, some of it park and woodland, and I knew every corner of them the way you know a thing you have walked past every day for longer than you can remember, which is not entirely the same as seeing it. I began to see it differently that March. I am not certain when it started. At some point I found myself noting, as I rode, things that Aloan had mentioned at dinner. The condition of the dry stone wall at the north boundary, which she had observed from the lane when Gibbs had taken her to the home farm, and which she had said, in passing, looked as though it wanted attention before the spring lambing made traffic through that field heavy. The wall did want attention. I had ridden past it perhaps 300 times without forming a view about it. I sent the estate carpenter the following week. She had also mentioned, without apparent intent to influence me, that the path between the kitchen garden and the home farm was awkward to walk in wet weather because of a low point where water collected. I rode past the low point and looked at it. She was right. It was the sort of problem that costs almost nothing to fix and has been tolerated for years because the person who would authorize the fix is also the person who spends his time on horseback rather than walking the path. I had the path regraded in late March. Prescott mentioned, when I told him about the path, that Miss Vane had mentioned it to Gibbs as well. "She mentioned it to Gibbs," I said. "She did," Prescott said. "He told her it had been like that for a long time. She said she imagined so." He folded the collar of my coat with unnecessary precision. "She mentioned several things to Mr. Gibbs." "What else?" I said. "Prescott told me. The fence along the south meadow. The gate at the kitchen garden that hung slightly wrong and in wet weather could not be opened without lifting. The chimney in the blue bedroom that smoked when the wind came from the east, which meant the east room was never warm in easterly weather. I had the fence mended, the gate rehung, and the chimney swept and its cowl adjusted. These were all very small things. They were the things that accumulate in a house where the person in charge of it has not been attending to it with both eyes. At dinner one evening in early March, I said, without introduction, "The gate is rehung." She looked up. "The kitchen garden gate." "Yes. It hangs properly now." "So I am told." She said very simply, "Good," and went back to her plate, And then after a moment she said, "The fence along the south meadow looked sound when I last saw it, but the post at the far corner has been repaired," I said. A pause, she looked at me, something in her expression that was not quite a question. "I rode out on Thursday," I said. "I see," she said, and then carefully, "Thank you." "The chimney in the blue bedroom has also been seen to," I said. Another pause. "I mentioned that to Mrs. Alderley," she said. "I did not expect." "It was a reasonable observation," I said. "The room is cold in easterly weather. It should not be." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have been paying attention." "I have been paying attention," I agreed. She looked down at her plate, and then back at me, and the expression on her face was one I had not seen before, not the composed expression, not the careful one, but something underneath those that was simply, quietly surprised. Not suspiciously surprised. Genuinely surprised in the way a person is surprised when they have not expected to be seen and discover that they are. I did not say anything further. I went back to my dinner, but I was aware of the change in the quality of the silence across the table, which was no longer the careful silence of two people keeping their distance, but something different. Something that had, I thought, a great deal more room in it. On a morning in the second week of March, I was returning from the far edge of the north pasture when I saw Elowen at the edge of the kitchen garden. She was wearing her coat, the not heavy enough one, though March was marginally kinder than February, and she was kneeling in the frost-softened earth by the south wall with a trowel, doing something careful and deliberate to the base of the rosemary. I rode through the gate and dismounted and stood holding the reins, watching her. She heard me and looked up. Her hands were dark with earth. She said, "I hope this is permitted. The plants need clearing around the base. There's a lot of dead wood from the winter, and if it's not removed, the new growth can't come through." "It's permitted," I said. She turned back to the plant. I stood with the horse's warm breath in the cold air and watched her work for a moment, the careful, practiced movements of a person who knows exactly what they are doing, who has done this before, who is not performing competence but simply exercising it. She was talking very quietly to the plant. I am not certain she was aware she was doing it. It was not words, exactly, a sort of murmured reassurance, the kind of thing you say to a living thing when you are tending it, not because it can hear you, but because the tending deserves to be spoken. I stood there longer than I had intended. The horse was patient. The morning was pale and still, and the grounds of Wynthorpe Hall stretched out around us, and the south wall of the kitchen garden had my mother's rosemary growing against it, and the woman kneeling in front of it was speaking quietly to it in a way that would have seemed, to most people, slightly eccentric, and seemed to me, at that moment, simply correct. "Elowen," I said. She looked up. I had called her by her name without the miss, and I heard it in the air between us and did not retract it. Something shifted in her face. "There is something I need to tell you," I said. She sat back on her heels. Her hands were still dark with earth. She looked at me with those clear gray eyes, and the morning was cold and white around us, and Wynthorpe Hall was 20 yards away with its windows catching the early light, and I thought, I have been afraid of this conversation because I was afraid she would leave, and I now understand that I have been afraid of it for a great deal longer than 3 weeks. I told her about the document. I told her that the settlement agreement, the document that had produced her arrival at Wynthorpe Hall, was a document I had not sought and had not, after reading it 4 times, found tolerable. I told her that I had asked Hartwell about it, and that what Hartwell had described as a satisfactory arrangement was in plain English a transaction in which she had been offered, without consultation, as a means of discharging her father's obligations. I told her that I had burned it. She did not speak immediately. She held my eyes for a long moment, and I could not tell what she was thinking. "When," she said. "The day you came to ask about your sister's letter." Another silence. The horse shifted beside me. She looked down at her hands, the earth-dark fingers, the earth she had been putting back rather than taking out, the careful work of clearing dead wood so the living thing could come through. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because I should have told you the day I burned it," I said, "and I was less courageous than I would have wished to be." A pause. "And because the debt no longer exists, which means your presence here is entirely your own affair, and I thought you should know that." "My own affair," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, carefully, "What does that mean practically?" "It means," I said, "that you are free to go whenever you choose and that nothing here constrains you and that your father's debt is discharged and that this—" I stopped. I said, "that this is not and will not be a debt repaid." She looked at me, "And if I stay?" My chest did something complicated. "Then you would stay," I said, "because you chose to stay." "And is there," she said very carefully, "any reason you would want me to stay, beyond the practical?" I had spent 30 years in the particular economy of a man who does not say unnecessary things, who keeps his interior life in careful order, who has learned, at some cost, that wanting things is a practice that leads to complicated outcomes. I looked at a Lowen Vane in the kitchen garden with her earth-dark hands and her plain-spoken clear eyes, and the hothouse violets she had known the names of at 30 yards, and I thought, I have been managed very expertly out of the habit of wanting, and I do not want to be managed out of this. "Yes," I said, "there are reasons I would want you to stay." She held my eyes. "Tell me one," she said. And I thought, I will not manage this. I am 38 years old and I have a house that was built for a family and a kitchen garden with my mother's rosemary still living under the frost, and a dining room table that seats 14 and has been set for one for 6 years. And this is the most direct person I have ever spoken to, and she is asking me a question, and she deserves an honest answer. I said, because there is not a room in this house that does not feel different since you arrived. Because I have thought about dinner, the actual conversation at dinner, every day since the 8th day you were here, which is when we first had one. Because you told me the east wing should be used again, and I knew immediately that you were right and I had been wrong for 6 years. Because you talked to plants. I stopped. I said, because I have spent 30 years in this house and I have not known anyone who looked at it the way you look at it, who asked what it looks like in summer, who cared whether the rosemary was still living under the frost. Lowen Vane looked at me for a long time. The morning was very still around us. Then she looked down at her hands and then at the rosemary, and then she looked back at me with an expression I recognized. Not the composed expression, not the careful expression, but the one underneath those, which I had only glimpsed before and which was, I now saw, quite remarkable. She said, I did not come here expecting to want to stay. No, I said, I imagine not. I came here expecting a transaction, she said, and to manage it as well as possible and to leave at the end of 12 months with what I could carry. She looked at the rosemary. I was going to ask you eventually whether I might take a cutting from the south wall. I said, you may have the whole wall. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile yet, not quite that, but the thing that comes just before a smile in a person who has not been given many reasons to. She said, I don't need the whole wall. Nevertheless, I said, it's yours, all of it, as long as you're here. She looked at me, and when I'm not, then we will discuss it, I said. But I would rather discuss how you might stay. Another long silence. The morning was absolutely still, and the horse was patient beside me, and the rosemary was alive under the frost, and I waited with the patience of a man who has been wrong about the most important things for 6 years, and is not prepared to be wrong about this one. Lowen said, I would need to be able to speak plainly. You have been speaking plainly since you arrived, I said. I have found it on balance extremely tolerable. I would need to be treated as a person who has chosen to be here, she said, and not as someone who was sent. You would be, I said. That is the entirety of my argument. She looked at me for one more long moment. Then she looked at the rosemary and at the earth on her hands and at the kitchen garden around her, the south wall and the frost-stiffened beds and the place where her mother's herbs had been planted years ago in some other garden in some other life. She said, all right. All right, I said. She turned back to the rosemary. I need to finish this, she said. The new growth is close. I'll see you at dinner, I said. Yes, she said, you will. I led the horse back to the stable, and the morning opened around me, the pale March light coming across the grounds of Wynthorpe Hall, and I thought, my father was wrong about most things he was optimistic about. He was not wrong about this house. We did not marry immediately. I want to be clear about that, because this is the sort of story where, once the moment in the kitchen garden has occurred, the mind leaps forward to the altar and the ring and the resolution, and I am going to resist that temptation because the truth is more interesting and more worth telling. What happened in the weeks after the kitchen garden was a slow and very carefully conducted process of two extremely cautious people deciding to trust each other, which is, I have found, the most difficult thing two people can do, and also, when it works, the thing that makes everything else work too. She stayed. She moved to the South Wing, at my suggestion, and with Mrs. Alderley's enthusiastic facilitation, Mrs. Alderley having apparently formed views about the situation that she was too scrupulous to voice, but too committed to fail to act upon. The East Wing was fully reopened and aired, the fires kept burning in the study and the sitting room. The dining room table was still set for one, in the technical sense, but the chair on the other side of it was always occupied, and dinner had become the part of the day I most looked forward to, which was something I had not said about any part of any day for 6 years. Hartwell received my letter with the philosophical equanimity of a solicitor who has been in practice for 30 years, and has seen a great many things become not what they began as. He wrote back 2 lines acknowledging the dissolution of the settlement terms and the discharge of the Vane debt, and then added a 3rd line that said he hoped the outcome was satisfactory, which was his way of expressing what would have been warmth in a different man. Crispin wrote when he heard. He wrote 4 pages, in his large, expressive hand, the substance of which was that he had known from the moment of the arrangement that it would come to good, and that he had always had every confidence in Aldrich's judgment, and that naturally he had foreseen the direction things would take. I wrote back 1 paragraph which did not address any of those claims. In the fortnight after the kitchen garden, I found myself conducting my days differently. Not dramatically so. I am not a man given to dramatic transformations, but differently in the way that matters, which is in where my attention went when I was not directing it somewhere specific. Before, my attention in the idle moments of a day went to estate business, or to the books I kept open on the library desk, or to nothing in particular, which is the particular vacancy of a man who has organized his life so thoroughly against wanting that he does not know what to do with the space. Now my attention went to whether there was something Aloin had mentioned that wanted looking at, or to what I might say at dinner that was worth saying, or, with some frequency, to wherever in the house she was, and whether it was reasonable to walk in that direction. I am told this was noticeable. Prescott has confirmed it. He did not say so at the time, having more tact than I generally give him credit for, but when I asked him, later, whether the change in my habits had been obvious, he said, with the measured expression of a man delivering a verdict, "From the 2nd week of March, Your Grace, yes." I rode out later in the mornings. Not much later, half an hour perhaps, but late enough that I often encountered Aloin in the kitchen garden before I went, or in the corridor outside the library, or in the East Wing where she had taken to sitting, exactly as I had given her leave to in my father's chair by the window. On a morning in late March, I came through the East Wing on my way to the study and found her there with a book open in her lap, the hothouse violets on the desk beside her, the morning light coming in through the window my father had argued with the architect about, and she looked up when she heard my step and said, "Good morning," and went back to her book, and I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then went to the study and sat down at my desk, and found I could not immediately recall what I had intended to do there. We walked together in the early evenings when the weather permitted. This began accidentally, or rather, it began because I was walking in the kitchen garden one evening and she was there, and we both continued walking, and by the time we had been through the garden and down to the kitchen pond and back by the lane to the house, neither of us had suggested turning back. After that, we simply walked together in the evenings when the day allowed. She asked me about the farm families, the tenants, the history of the various fields and boundaries. I found myself telling her things I had not told anyone, not because they were secret, but because there had been no one who asked, and when there is no one who asks, you do not know, after long enough, that you have things to say. She told me about her grandfather's farm in return. She told me about the 3 drainage systems and what she had learned watching the 3rd one being planned and dug, and about her mother's kitchen garden, which had been quite different from mine, a flatter site, more sheltered, given to different things. And about the summer she had been 12 and had grown 6 varieties of sweet pea against the south wall, and they had all bloomed in the same week, and her mother had cut them all and put them in every room in the house. "What happened to the garden?" I said. "Sold with the house," she said. "When my mother died, my father sold the house within the year. He said it was too painful to keep." "Was it?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lane ahead of us. "I think," she said carefully, "that it was too expensive to keep and too painful to admit that. The painful was real, but it was not the only reason." I thought about my father's East Wing. I thought about 6 years of Holland covers. "Yes," I said, "I understand that." She looked at me then in the late afternoon light, with the look that was becoming familiar to me, the clear, direct look that was not performing understanding but simply had it, because she had looked at things clearly for long enough that understanding was the natural result. She said, "The East Wing." "Yes," I said. "You should have opened it years ago," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," I agreed. "But you didn't know how," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said no. She nodded as though I had confirmed something she had already suspected. We walked back to the house in the last of the light, and she said nothing further about it, which was correct of her, because the thing had been acknowledged and did not require further handling, and she was the sort of person who knows the difference. It was in the 4th week of March that she told me about Marjorie's response to the letter. She brought it to dinner, not dramatically, not as a problem, just as information she thought I should have. Marjorie, she said, was relieved to hear that the arrangement had not been what the original terms implied. Marjorie had also said, in her letter back, that she was glad Alohan was well, and that the house sounded a great deal better than she had feared, and that she hoped Alohan was not wasting her considerable abilities on something smaller than she was capable of. "What did you say to that?" I said. "I said I was not wasting them," Alohan said. She looked at me across the table. "I said I was using them on a kitchen garden and a south pasture and a house that had not had anyone paying proper attention to it for some years, and that I found that extremely adequate." "Extremely adequate," I repeated. "She asked me to be more specific about the drainage," Alohan said, "so I wrote her another letter." I looked at her. "Your sister is interested in drainage." "Her husband's family have farms north of Harrogate," Alohan said. "She's been trying to improve the South Field for 2 years. I told her to hire someone who has done it before and to stand over them while they work, because the tendency when you're not watching is to cut the depth short." She picked up her fork. "If you ever had occasion to meet her, you would like her." "I would." "You're both extremely specific about things," she said, "and both of you think most conversations are shorter than they need to be." She ate a bite and added without looking up, "I find it restful, actually, in both cases." I found, to my considerable surprise, that I had nothing to say to that in the best possible way. The letter from Marjorie and the dinner in which it was discussed, and the evening walks and the mornings in the East Wing, these were the weeks I mean when I say that the certainty grew. Not like a verdict. More like the rosemary, alive under the frost long before the frost lifted. And by the time I found myself standing beside her in the May kitchen garden, having spent 2 weeks trying to identify the correct manner of asking, and having concluded that there was no correct manner and that I should simply speak, by then the certainty was not new. It had simply become impossible to ignore. We argued about the home farm in April. I want to include this because it is true, and because it tells you something important about who she is, and because it was, in its own way, one of my favorite weeks. She had walked out to the farm with Gibbs to look at the lambing, which she had asked permission to do, and in the course of the visit she had apparently said several things to Gibbs about the condition of the south-facing pasture, that Gibbs had found so compelling that he had come to me with her suggestions before I had even known the visit had occurred. I called her to the library to ask about it, not angrily, but with the particular precision of a man who prefers to understand a situation before responding to it. And she had told me, with complete composure, that the south pasture had been overwintered badly, and the drainage was wrong, and the flock would do better if the lower section were rotated, and there was an easy fix to the drainage that would cost almost nothing if it were done in May. "You know about drainage," I said. "My mother's family were farmers," she said without apology. "Before they were anything else. My grandfather built 3 drainage systems on his land. I watched him survey the 3rd one when I was 11. "You did not think to mention this to me," I said. "I thought to mention it to your steward," she said, "because it was a question about the farm." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "In future, mention it to me as well." She looked at me. "Is that because you want to know what I think, or because you prefer to know before Gibbs does?" A pause. I considered the question seriously, as she had clearly intended it to be considered. Both, I said. She seemed to find this acceptable. All right, she said. The south pasture will cost you 3 times as much to fix in the autumn if the summer is wet. I understand, I said. Do it in May. She did it in May. Gibbs reported that the drainage work had taken 2 days and cost 14 shillings, and had been overseen with remarkable precision by Miss Vane, who had apparently known exactly what she was asking for, and had been on site for both days, in practical boots that she had procured from somewhere without asking anyone's assistance. I thanked Gibbs and went to find Elowen, who was in the kitchen garden in the late May afternoon in a lighter coat, with her sleeves pushed up, working on the beds with the purposeful attention of someone who has assessed what needs doing and is now simply doing it. The south pasture is done, I said. I know, she said. Gibbs told me. 14 shillings, I said. I know, she said again. She did not look up from what she was doing. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at me. You're pleased. I am, I said, and somewhat astonished. Don't be astonished, she said, not unkindly. I told you what the problem was. You told me what the problem was, I agreed. I am pleased that I listened. Something in her expression shifted, and she said, So am I. We looked at each other in the May afternoon, and I thought, I have spent 30 years in this house, and I have had many conversations in it, and I cannot identify one that mattered more than this, and I am going to say something today that I should have said 3 weeks ago, and this time I am not going to be afraid of it. Elowen, I said. She looked at me. I would like to ask you something, I said, and I want you to understand that it is a question and not an arrangement, and you may answer it however you like. She held very still. I have spent a considerable portion of this spring trying to work out the correct manner in which to ask you to marry me, I said, and I have concluded that there is no correct manner, and that the only approach consistent with the kind of honesty you have a right to expect from me is to simply ask you directly. A long silence. I am asking you directly, I said, if you would do me the honor of being my wife. Another long silence. Elowen Vane was looking at me in the kitchen garden with the May afternoon around her and the south wall of rosemary and new growth behind her, and her expression was the one I had seen first in glimpses, the real one, the one under the composure, and it was doing something I had not seen it do before, which was exactly what I needed it to do. She said, You burned the document. Yes. You didn't tell me you burned it, she said, because you were afraid of what I would think. Yes. You were afraid I would leave. Yes. She looked at me. I was going to ask you for a cutting from the south wall, she said, to take with me when I left. I was going to plant it somewhere it would do well. I know, I said. You told me. I don't want a cutting anymore, she said. My chest did the complicated thing again. I said no. I want the wall, she said, if you're still offering the whole wall. I told you, I said, it's yours. She looked at me for a very long time. The May afternoon was perfectly still. Then she said, yes. Yes, I said, to be certain. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. I looked at her, at the earth on her hands and the new growth on the south wall and the expression she was wearing. That was, I realized, exactly what happiness looks like on a person who has learned to be careful about it. And I thought, my father was very optimistic about this house. He was right to be. We were married at the end of June. Not at a cathedral, and not before the assembled society of the county, and not with the kind of ceremony that requires a great deal of advance preparation, and a considerable number of people who have strong opinions. We were married in the parish church at the edge of the Wynthorpe estate, in the morning, with Mrs. Alderley and Prescott and Gibbs and the home farm's head shepherd, who had been at Wynthorpe Hall since my father's time and who had apparently been asking Gibbs about the date for several weeks, in the manner of a man who has decided he is owed a happy ending. Crispin attended, to his great satisfaction. He has been dining out on the story ever since, having decided, in the way that people who arrange things badly sometimes decide, that the good outcome vindicates the bad arrangement. It does not. But I have chosen not to have that argument with him more than 3 times per year, which I consider a reasonable restraint. Hartwell sent flowers from York. They arrived the morning of the wedding with a note of 2 lines and a 3rd line that said he was very glad, which was the most expressive communication I had ever received from him, and which I kept. The kitchen garden flowers that morning were extraordinary. Aloan had not planned them specifically for the wedding. She had been tending the beds in the ordinary course of things. But the timing was exact anyway, the way the things she attends to have a habit of being exact. The rosemary from the south wall was in full leaf by the last week of June, rich and fragrant and exactly as it had been in my mother's time, perhaps better. She carried a small bunch of it, tied simply, and she wore a dress that was not the traveling dress with the mended cuff, though she had kept that. She told me later she had kept it because the color of the mend was almost right, and she had gotten used to the slight difference. The dress she wore for the wedding was pale gray, the color of her eyes, and she looked in the morning light of the church like exactly what she was. A person who has come through difficult weather and arrived somewhere she had not expected to want to arrive, and is quietly, entirely glad. I remember the moment she looked at me from across the church, and I thought, I have stood in this church perhaps 100 times, for christenings and harvests and the services my mother made me attend, and the ones I attended myself in the years after, and I have never been as certain of anything in this building as I am certain of this. I have been asked in later years, by Prescott, who considers himself entitled to this information on the grounds of long service, by my brother Crispin, who considers himself entitled to everything, by Mrs. Alderley, who asked once, with the air of someone who had waited long enough and was owed an answer, what made me certain. The question, I think, assumes that certainty arrived like a verdict, all at once, final, undeniable. That is not how it was. What happened was more like the rosemary, things that were alive under the frost long before the frost lifted, things that had been growing toward something for weeks before it was visible. I cannot name one moment and call it the moment. I can name a series of moments and say, this was the direction the whole winter was moving. The morning she came to the library about her sister's letter, and asked for the truth, whatever the truth was. The evening in the east drawing room when she had curtsied and not flinched, and held my eyes with a composure that was the bravest thing I had seen in a very long time. The night the braised beef went wrong, and she said, with complete composure, that the braising liquid had been added too late, and went back to her plate with the equanimity of a person who does not require a meal to be perfect in order to be present for it. The night at dinner when she said my father was optimistic and laughed, the first time I heard her laugh, which was a sound of genuine amusement, unperformed, brief and warm and entirely itself. The morning she was talking to the rosemary, and did not stop talking to it when she heard my step, because she had decided by then that I was not the kind of person she needed to perform for, and she was right, and I was, obscurely, very glad to have been correctly assessed. What I can say is that, by the morning in the kitchen garden in March, I was entirely certain, and that the certainty had nothing to do with the document being burned, or the debt being cleared, or any of the arrangements that had produced her arrival. Those things I can now review with the hindsight of a man who eventually understood that the situation had forced a reckoning I would otherwise have avoided for another 6 years. That I had needed, perhaps, the specific injustice of a document I had not chosen and could not accept, to ask me to look clearly at what I was actually refusing. I was refusing to want anything again, and she had, without trying to, made that refusal impossible. I said at the beginning that I was not a man who believed in justice. What I understand now, which I did not understand then, in the way that the most important understandings tend to arrive, not as revelations but as the accumulated weight of many small, true things, is that justice is not an abstraction. It is a practice. It is the act of seeing, clearly and without the interference of what is convenient or comfortable, what is actually in front of you. It is what you do when you read a document 4 times and understand what it means and burn it, and sit alone with that decision long enough to understand what you are choosing instead. It is what Aloan Vane did every day of her life, the clear-eyed, plain-spoken, undeceived practice of seeing things as they were, and saying what she found, and not allowing the inconvenience of truth to make her say something else. She brought it into this house. Or rather, I see it now more clearly than I could then. She showed me that it had been here all along, in the rosemary my mother planted, in the east wing my father built, in the south pasture that needed its drainage fixed, and the kitchen garden gate that hung wrong, and the table in the dining room that was set for one, and should have been set for more. The house had been waiting, as houses do, for someone to see what it actually was and say so. I was 38 years old when a Lowen Vane arrived at Wynthorpe Hall in a hired trap with one trunk and the debt of a ruined man's mistakes trailing behind her. I am 51 now. The kitchen garden south wall is dense and fragrant and absolutely hers. She has added to it over the years in ways my mother would have entirely approved of, and she tends it with the same careful, practical attention she brings to everything, which is to say the attention of someone who understands that a living thing needs tending, not only admiring. The east wing is open and occupied and has been used by a succession of people who were glad to be there. The dining room table seats 14 and frequently requires all of them, and the house has, I am told by everyone who comes to it, the particular quality of a place where someone has been paying attention, where the gate opens properly, and the south pasture drains and the hothouse violets appear in the study in February as though by agreement. I have been asked whether I regret the manner of her coming, the document, the arrangement, the bad beginning that was made without either of our knowledge or consent. The honest answer is, I regret the injustice of it. I do not regret the morning she arrived, or the way she turned from the window of the east drawing room in her own good time, or the moment in the kitchen garden in March when she said she didn't want a cutting anymore, she wanted the wall. She is, as she would herself say without any vanity at all, a practical person. The wall has been hers since the day I offered it, and will be hers as long as there is a Wynthorpe Hall, and as long as I have anything to say about it, which, as any member of my household will tell you, is a considerable and undiminished amount. She is, of all the things that have ever been in this house, the thing I am most certain I deserve least and most grateful to have been given. Not as a debt, never as a debt. As a choice,